Hello everyone. Welcome back to the stream. We don't usually get to see this particular side of my knowledge base because it happens that when you are running an semi-educational content creation operation, perhaps some of the more physical skills, the ones that are harder to translate into the digital, don't get to come up quite as often. And I just have so much to talk about. Like many people, I lost several family members and loved ones in the past year, including my my judo instructor, Sensei Robert Corella. He was a good friend of mine for many years. I met him in college for a Japanese language competition. I was studying Japanese language in college because I wanted to enter the foreign service. So I wanted to pick up some foreign language skills, and so I was taking some Japanese classes. And in the course of the Japanese language competition that we had at Phoenix College, I had mentioned that I was also, in conjunction to taking my Japanese class, that I was also studying judo because I thought that I would get some kind of, vocabulary boost out of it. And that was the beginning of a very long relationship with Sensei Bum. As you can see, I've inherited so many of Sensei's books and manuals and texts and illustrations and catalogs of so many different kinds. What here that I have on the screen now is only maybe like an eighth of the total books that I've inherited from Sensei. The content of them is mostly about Jujitsu and Judo, but also about Iaido, which Sensei in his later years was really, really heavily involved in, and not so much Judo. But he was on top of being, the first transmitter of Iaido from Japan to Arizona, and that's how a lot of people know Sensei Bob. But way before that, way before he ever went to, he studied and went to university and was part of the Sister Cities program. Way before that, he studied judo right here in Phoenix, Arizona. Actually, at the time, they were calling the beginning of this club the Phoenix Judo Institute, but it was the Phoenix Boys Club. The Phoenix Boys Club is where Sensei Bob trained at with a lot of his younger friends that he hung out with right up until the very later years of his life. He remained very close friends with them. But yeah, Sensei left so much, and it's just really hard to kind of know where to start because the full breadth of the material is this is only the stuff that's pertinent that I can really speak on. I can talk about judo, but Sensei was a master of Japanese fine art and swordsmanship and sword repairing and blacksmithing and calligraphy, and he spoke fluent Japanese. So he had so much knowledge that I don't know if I'll ever have as much knowledge as that Sensei's already lost. But the significance of it certainly isn't lost on me, and it certainly is a treasure to have some of these really, really old judo texts from the early 1900s. We have a couple in here that are from like the 1930s, the 1950s. And we've got a couple of ones of some jujitsu books, and they're quite old. Sensei was a collector of all these kind of things, but it's because he was a lifelong collector um, of just any kind of supplemental material he could find on judo and martial arts. Um, I think maybe perhaps because it is illustrated, we can start with this illustrated Kodokan Judo. Looks like this one used to belong to Steve Cooley. So illustrated Kodokan Judo. Danippon Yubenkai Kodoshan. Okay. Tokyo. So it was printed in 1955. And then there's a preface here. The Kodokan Judo, although it only took its place as a physical and mental training and as a martial art in 1882, is already an international sport and is practiced according to the same rules everywhere. Apart from its homeland, Japan, it is especially popular in Europe and in America and is practiced universally by both sexes. This judo is a modern adaptation of traditional jujitsu, one of the martial arts of old Japan and one of the precise legacies of the samurai. And this reformation should be attributed to the late Dr. Jigoro Kano, founder of the Kodokan, who improved and elevated the old jujitsu into a scientific system equally as suitable for the culture of mankind as for a martial art, and even as a modern sport, if the student prefers. Moreover, he wielded it to a high ideal, an unprecedented achievement in his field. It has been pointed out to us that the need has long existed for a new book on judo, which can be compiled from a new point of view. A more complete book designed to meet the requirements of the times. Numerous are works of the kind that have been offered to the public ever since the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905. We feel at liberty to assert, without detracting in the least from the works of our predecessors, that they fail in many essential points to measure up to the ideal of what a judo book should be, in that they lack the theoretical side of judo, such as a history, aims, and purpose. Principle of Ju, the all-prevailing principle of judo, preliminary exercises, things necessary for the exercise, and other important items which are indispensable to the practice of judo. 2, they are nothing but simple manuals and partial explanations of judo techniques. And 3, totally lack the explanations of kata, which are regarded as the grammar in a composition. In this illustrated Kodokan Judo, we have tried to explain judo as one complete system, and to present the most complete and authoritative work at present. So we have given explanation of the most useful randori waza, techniques of free exercise, and all of the kata, rearranged forms, together with many cine-action photos and other pictures in order to make the movements easy to understand. With respect to the models who have posed for these illustrations, we have enlisted the aid of many masters and high-ranking judoka in each field. To attain great proficiency in judo as a technique, it is needless to say most advisable for the student to receive actual instruction in the techniques from an able teacher. But also he needs to correctly be informed of the basic general aspect of judo and other techniques themselves, such as we have mentioned in the preceding paragraph. For this alone, the present volume will be a good reference book for the novice under instruction. At the same time, we believe it will serve as a manual for those unable to obtain the assistance of proper instruction. Not only that, We believe it will also be a valuable information book for the advanced students as well as for instructors in general. There is one thing we regret in this work. Some of the pictures used are somewhat lacking in clarity because we use Cine Action photos already owned by the Kodokan. Notwithstanding this, however, we decided to use them because, one, the judoka appearing in them is most eminent authorities on judo, and they include the 4 highest masters, including Dr. Kano, who have already passed away, and with these, their last photos, we wish to dedicate the present volume to them. If to our great pleasure, the reader gains a correct knowledge of the Kodokan through this book, and more advances himself in the practice of judo, then the aim of this publication will be accomplished. Rise Kano, President of the Kodokan Tokyo, December 25th, 1954. With that said, I'm gonna skim the books. Look for interesting information. If you've made it this far into the video, I appreciate your assistance in my my journey to understand some of the lost knowledge that Sensei has left behind for me. Like Sensei, I also trained at the Kodokan, but not for nearly as long. My Japanese not nearly as fluent as Sensei's. But still, I can enjoy a great amount of this. I'm going to take very great care with this particular book because it does appear to be unbinding. So that is something I'm going to have to rectify. So we will be very gentle. So we got Chapter 1, History of the Kodokan, History of Jujitsu, Circumstances which led to the rise and development of Jujitsu, the development of Kodokan Judo. Those are all things which are very hardly ever talked about when we talk about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where Jiu-Jitsu comes from, where Judo comes from. A lot of that gets lost in the discussion, and it really underscores the fact that Judo, Jiu-Jitsu, traditional Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's all the same thing. It all comes from the same place. It all originates from the same place. And it's merely the circumstance of our times in which formality and use in martial combat, kind of dictate the application of the techniques. But the techniques themselves are relatively the same. Barring the use of like a temiwaza, things like that, which are kind of not completely lost to some forms of jujitsu, but really relegated to the highest level of jujitsu and judo, certainly. Because even I, as someone who's trained at the Kodokan and holds a shodan, not that that's a high rank, but you just don't do a lot of temiwaza. You just don't do a lot of striking and punching. In judo, jujitsu, even though it exists at the higher levels for the purpose of kata, but you just don't do it a lot. Perhaps in time, I will be able to dedicate myself to the study of some of the atemiwaza. There's just so much in here. It's categorized very methodically. Are these categorized by body, by grouping? Basic movements, classifications of techniques, explanations of throws. Diashi, Hizaguruma, Sasekuri Omiyashi, Ukigoshi, Osotogari Ogosh. No, they're not necessarily in order, now are they? Yeah, or at least not in body type. They could be grouped in a different way. I'm not sure if they're grouped to like Gokyo no Waza or something like that. Yes, there's some very good stuff in here too. Explanations of forms of gentleness. Sukidashi, kata oshi, ryotedori, kata mawashi. Yeah, those are all very good. This is a lot of the subtle information that I think a lot of contemporary judoka and jujitsuka probably don't have access to, or at least at the bare minimum don't have the language to articulate it in the way that perhaps our progenitors and you know teachers before us in the way that they would have. Tandoku renshu. Tandoku renshu. Yeah. Solo practice. I always called it jubun renshu. One man practice. A guide to the Kodokan, contest rules of judo, plates. I wonder what a plate is. Editorial committee. Toshio Daigyo, Shigukuni Eguchi, Masaru Hayakawa, sorry, I am a little blind. Tatsuo Hisatomi, Yoji Kikuchi, Maso Koyasu, Ichizo Kudo, Teisuke Masahiko, Yoshizo Matsumoto, Kyozo Mifune. Sensei Mifune was on the editorial committee for this particular one. How amazing is that? Of course, Kyozo Mifune is the one and only legendary god of judo, said to be never defeated in contest. He's never been thrown. The only judoka to never be thrown. Isao Nagahata, Tsunetane Oda, Kachiro Samura, Itsu Yasawa, Saburo Takahiro, Shenjinori Tasahiro, Takashi Uzawa, Yasushi Yamada. Fantastic illustration, first of all. The exercise, which is now practiced throughout the world under the simple name Judo, should properly speaking be called the Kodokan Judo. We will therefore give an outline of the history of the Kodokan Judo in the following chapters. The Kodokan Judo of today is based on the traditional Jujitsu, or Jujitsu of old Japan. The techniques of latter, re-examined, refined, systemized, and wielded to an ideal became those of the former. Thus, it may be said that Kodokan Judo has elevated Jujitsu, art or practice, to do, or way and or principle. And this, of course, refers to the do is a condensed form of the Japanese word for dori, which is path or street. And it literally means that when something has elevated, when a practice has been so elevated that it now becomes a pathway to enlightenment in of itself. It is a method in which the body can hone itself, the mind can hone itself, the spirit can hone itself, and probably I think the idea would be so that you could actualize some independent enlightenment. But of course, Dr. Kano was notably agnostic when it came to spirituality in terms of judo, which is a stark contrast from from O Sensei Morihei Ushiba from Aikido, who embraced spirituality, who had a big spiritual awakening of his own. But I believe that's also part of the character of both of the masters too, certainly, because Dr. Kano was probably more of the Taoist mind, in that the teachings and the philosophy themselves carry the message that you want to have. And so Dr. Kano is actually very overt in a lot of his discussions about what judo is and what it means and what it can do for humanity, and why it's beneficial for our communities, and how it helps bridge gaps, and how it teaches us to show humility, and it shows us that we can grow. I don't know. That seems like something we're sorely needing nowadays. The Kodokan of Judo is based on the traditional Jujitsu. Yeah. What then was Jujitsu, the prototype of Judo? It has been known by dozens of different names, such as Yawari, Taijutsu, Wajutsu, Torite, Kogutsuku, Kempo, Hakuda, Kumuichi, Shubaku, Kosho no Mowari, etc. It had numerous schools, each of which was distinguished from each other by its own individual features, but generally speaking, Jujitsu may be defined as an art of attack and defense without, or occasionally with, weapons, against opponents with or without weapons. The origin of Jujitsu is lost in the mists of antiquity. The Nihon Shoki, the Chronicle of Japan, a history compiled by, wait for it, anticipation, by Imperial Command in 720 AD, refers to a tournament of Chikara Kurabe, the contest of strength, which was held in the 7th year of the Emperor Sunin. Emperor Sunin, 230 BC. This is regarded by some historians as the beginning of sumo, or Japanese wrestling, which has something in common with Jujitsu. Although it's questionable whether the said Chikara Kurabe bore any relation to either sumo or Jujitsu of later days, the event is recorded as an important authentic historical proof showing the embryonic stage of both sumo and Jujitsu in the remote past. The first instance of the word yawari occurring in Japanese literature is to be found in the Konjaku Monogatari, the once upon a time stories, which are said to have been written in the latter half of the 11th century. As the word yawara mentioned in the book is found in the story about sumo, we cannot identify it directly with Jujitsu, but in any case, it is interesting documentary item which deserves the attention of Jujitsu historians. According to the Bujutsu Ryusoroku, the biographies of the founders of various martial arts exercise schools and other kindred martial arts, there existed in days prior to the establishment of the Kodokan Judo some 20 Ryu, schools of Jujitsu, such as Takunochi Ryu, Sekiguchi Ryu, Kyushin Ryu, Kito Ryu, and Tenshin Ryo Ryu, the last two of which were especially studied by the late Professor Jigoro Kano, our founder. The differences between the various schools were chiefly attributed to the specializations in certain techniques of Jujitsu by the teachers. But at times, it would seem that a few Jujitsu masters founded new schools simply for their own publicity purposes, and there were schools differing in name, but practically identical in substance. That's pretty interesting, right? Before the advent of Japan, or Hon, the circumstances which led to the rise and development of Jujitsu. A. Before the advent of firearms in Japan, Bows and arrows had been employed in warfare from the earliest times. In close combat, swords and spears were used by the warriors, and occasionally they had to fight with their bare hands. This was called kumiuchi, the more advanced techniques of which contributed to the development of Jujitsu. For centuries, Japanese warriors used to wear two swords, one long, one short, until this custom was banned in 1871 under the decree abolishing the wearing of swords. However, often when in the presence of a high personage, he had to appear without the long sword, especially in the Tokugawa period of the long swords were taboo in the court of the shogun, while the retinue of the guard and minor officials were allowed to wear short swords only. The same was the case with prison keepers. They needed a special art for self-defense as well as for controlling their charges without killing them. Special methods such as hitting, poking, or chopping the hands, fingers, elbows, fists, and kicking the kneecaps, heel, ball of the foot, or bending or twisting the joints were studied and developed so that an unarmed person or person who was purposefully restrained from using his weapons could subdue an adversary. For several hundred years before the Meiji era, through the feudal age, class distinction was rigidly enforced between the warrior and the commoner, the latter being ordainedly forbidden to wear any sword. Naturally, for self-defense purposes, commoners had to learn the art of bare-handed fighting. The basic circumstances described above that led to the development of Jujitsu are closely interlocked and cannot be clearly separated from one another. But from the extent Densho, the manual, script instruction, and records of secrets by the founders of various schools, we may readily perceive their respective characteristics. For instance, in some Densho, there are minute instructions, together with pictorial instructions on how to capture a ruffian and bind him with rope. Such details, though they may lie outside the scope of Jujitsu proper, are profoundly interesting where they serve to show concretely the kind of soil out of which the particular Jujitsu technique has grown. So it's very good at illustrating the culture and climate in which ancient Jujitsu prospered and grew, and where Judo would eventually take place. So it's Kumiuchi, the grappling of samurai. Let's see if we can get a little bit of that in there. There's some good shots. Very good stuff. Sorry if I'm jostling you. If you're getting jostled. For historical study of Jujitsu, there were two sources, historical and literary works in general, and two, the various Densho mentioned before. History books contain comparatively few references to Jujitsu, but there are more to be found in the miscellaneous writings of each period. As for the documents of individual schools, each school, in its eagerness to add luster to itself and to enhance its own prestige, adorned its origin and records with flowery rhetoric so that their content, in some cases, will have to be taken with a grain of salt. Moreover, some Densho, while of antique origin, are manuscript copies of later hands, so that a high degree of authenticity is doubtful. Nevertheless, it may be safely deduced from the records available today that Jujitsu began to take a systemized form in the later half of the 16th century, and that the various schools came into the being in the centuries from the 17th century to about the beginning of the 19th. As for the tenets or doctrinal principles of Jujitsu, the instructions of the various schools mostly dwell on the ideas which may be seen as in the most famous old book on strategy selected by the Chinese strategist Huang Shikong, which was the Bible for our warriors in the feudal age, namely in wielding is strength. Oaks may fall when reeds brave the storm, but they also echo the Chinese philosophy represented in the book of Lao Tzu, who preached non-resistance and gentleness, or Lao Tse, or the Yi King, the Book of Changes. Oh yeah, I think that's still Lao Tzu. I think that just may be a very early translation of Lao Tzu. There is little original thinking, although occasionally one encounters passages which indicate an aspiration to the ideal of Bushido, the passages which are exactly in line with the spirit of Kodokan Judo. A word may be added about the legend of Jujitsu was originally introduced to Japan by the Chinese, named by a Chinese named Chen Wanping, approximately in 1644 through 48, or in 1627, according to the Kokushoji document. However, a large amount of authentic evidence disproves this. For instance, we have reliable records of the Japanese Jiu-Jitsu masters, such as Hitotsubashi Joken or Sekaguchi Jushin, who thrived years before the above dates. Authentic descriptions of Jujitsu are found in documents such as the Yukisenjo Monogatari and the Kyuyame-gusa, and the old Jujitsu Densho, which also predate the legend. This is not necessarily to deny the Chen Yuanping introduced Chinese boxing Kempo to Japan. Indeed, it is more or less reasonable to assume that Kempo had some influence on Jiu-Jitsu. And so, with that, they even acknowledge the external forces that certainly must have played on Dr. Kano and the ancient Jiu-Jitsu masters. So certainly the striking arts, the pre-karate, the ancient Kempo, certainly it must have had some kind of influence. Very interesting. Omoshiroi. Very interesting. Just want to see how much is left in this particular chapter, because it's actually very fascinating. We can do it. The development of Kodokan Judo. In order to trace the birth of Kodokan Judo, it's necessary to first look back upon the social circumstances of the period. Professor Jigoro Kano, founder of the Kodokan, was born in the seaside town of Mikage, near Kobe, in 1860. He moved with his family to Tokyo in 1871. Those were the years during which Japan witnessed many revolutionary changes, political and otherwise. The Tokugawa shogunate crumbled and the imperial rule was restored in 1868. With the collapse of the feudal system of the nation, casting to the wind all culture and institutions of old, was avidly aping the ways of the advanced countries of Europe and America. For example, the no drama, one of the traditional arts of the country, was suddenly deprived of its patronage of the clan lords, who incidentally lost their princely domains. A story is told of the famous no master, who went begging from door to door, reciting popular passages from his repertoire. The ordinance prohibiting samurai from wearing swords in 1871 signaled a swift decline of all martial arts, and Jiu-Jitsu was no exception. Its various schools, once strongly entrenched at numerous clan capitals throughout the country, were now tottering on the brink of ruin. Just how did Jigoro Kano, a student of Tokyo Imperial University at the age of 18, happen to take up this dying art? The question is simply answered. A young gentleman of no sizable physique, he was too proud to yield, and smarting under the bullying of bigger companions, he wanted to get strong by some means or other. On hearing about Jujitsu, an exercise by which a man of small strength can be a man of Herculean strength, he at once made up his mind to learn it. However, owing to the social conditions as mentioned above, which had caused many Jujitsu masters to turn to other occupations, it was difficult to find a suitable teacher. He finally met Teonosuke Yagi, who taught him the rudiments of Jujitsu. Later, he studied under Hachinosuke Fukuda and Masatomo Iso of the Tenshin Chiyo Ryu and Tsunetoshi Ikubo of the Kito Ryo, and was initiated into the secrets of both schools. Then he established his own school named Kodokan in 1882 and began to teach his own exercise, calling it judo instead of jujitsu. He was then 23 years old and one of the faculty of the Gakushin-in, the peer school. Meanwhile, his characteristic zeal and tireless energy was not satisfied with this. He continued to explore the mysteries of other schools as well as to improve his own exercise, taking great pains to visit others, other famous masters of the art and to study the old densho. Finally, he attained a height hitherto unknown in the realm of Jujitsu. The process of the evolution of Judo from Jujitsu is told by Professor Kano in one of his early lectures, given to his students in 1898. While studying Jujitsu, not only did I find it is interesting, but also realized it was most effective for the training of both body and mind. It therefore occurred to me to disseminate it far and wide. But it was necessary to improve the old Jujitsu to a certain degree in order to popularize it, because the old style was not developed or devised for physical education or moral or intellectual training. The latter, in fact, were nothing but the incidental blessings or benefits of the former, which was excessively devised for winning. On the other hand, knowing that every one of the Jujitsu schools had its merits and demerits, I came to believe that it would be necessary to reconstruct Jujitsu even as an exercise for martial purposes. So by taking together all of the good points I had learned of the various schools and the adding thereto my own devices and inventions, I founded a new system of physical culture and mental training as well as for winning contests. I called this Kodokan Judo. Why did I call this Judo instead of Jujitsu? Because what I teach is not simply jutsu or jitsu, art or practice or technique. Of course I teach jutsu, but it is upon do, or the way or principle, that I wish to lay upon special stress. Nowadays, it is common for people to say judo for jujitsu. But before I began to teach my judo, the term had been adopted only by one school, the Jikishin Ryu. It was a very rarely used among others. It was a very rarely used among other schools. I purposefully chose this rarely used term in other to distinguish my school from the common run of jujitsu schools. The reason why I did not adopt a totally new name is as follows. The Kodokan Judo I teach, as compared with the old Jujitsu, aims wider and differs in techniques so that I may have given it a new name. But after all, it is generally based on what I had learned from former teachers, so I did not like to give it an entirely new name. There are two other reasons why I avoided the term Jujitsu. One is that there were Jujitsu schools which often indulged in violent and dangerous techniques in throwing or twisting arms and legs. Seeing these things, many people had come to believe that Jujitsu was harmful. Again, in an exercise hall where supervision was inadequate, the senior pupils would wantonly throw down the juniors or pick quarrels so that Jujitsu was despised as something that made rowdies of young men. I wished to show that what I taught was not a dangerous thing and would not needlessly injure any person. That it was not the Jujitsu as taught by some people, and that it was Judo, an entirely different thing. The second reason was that I began to teach Jujitsu had fallen into disrepute. Some Jujitsu masters made their living by organizing troops composed of their followers and putting on exhibition matches to which admission fees were charged. Others went so far as to stage bouts between professional sumo wrestlers and Jujitsu men. Such degrading practices of prostituting a martial art were repugnant to me, so I avoided the term Jujitsu and adopted Judo in its stead. Then, to distinguish it from my school, Kodokan Judo, though the title is rather long. Such was the outline of the genesis of Kodokan Judo, as told in the words of Professor Kano himself. When the Kodokan was first established in 1882, its dojo, the exercise hall, was only a 12-mat room. 12 feet by 18 feet in size, and the students in the first year numbered 9 in all. Today, the Kodokan, which recently celebrated the 70th anniversary of its founding, has a 500 mat, 100 by 100 foot exercise hall, and the number of pupils, men, women, young and old, and disregarding of race and nationality, is counted in the millions. One of the ardent visions during the last days of the late Professor Kano is the International Federation of Judo is realized at last with his son, the present president of the Kodokan, and the president of the Federation with the Kodokan as its headquarters. When we look back upon the past, our hearts are full with deep emotion. Many stories and anecdotes are told about the difficulties of which confronted Professor Kano and the great pains taken by him when teaching the art of judo in the early days of the Kodokan. But we regret that we are compelled to omit them because of the lack of space. Having endured every hardship and having overcome many difficulties, the Kodokan, in spite of its youth and small size, made rapid progress, winning the wide public recognition in a few years. Then, in 1886, it gained a dramatic fashion, undisputed leadership in the field. About that time, with the stabilization of social conditions in the country, the old Jujitsu schools were staging a comeback. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Board, because of the function of its office, took an active interest in the revival of Jujitsu, as well as Kenjutsu, the Japanese fencing and other martial arts. The new Kodokan Judo was the center of public attention. Everyone admired its tenets and slogans and its high idealism, but its practical merits in combat were looked upon with doubts and suspicion, and even contempt by old Jujitsu men, including the then outstanding master, Hikosuke Totsuka, who commanded a very large following. Naturally, there developed a keen rivalry between the Totsuka school and the Kodokan. In 1886, under the auspices of the Chief Metropolitan Police, a grand tournament was arranged between both schools. This was a I know this story. I know this legend. It was a decisive battle. Defeat would have been fatal to the Kodokan, but in the tournament, to which each school sent 15 picked men, the Kodokan won all bouts, excepting 2 which ended in a draw. The brilliant victory established once and for all the supremacy of Kodokan Judo over all Jujitsu schools, not only in principles, but also in techniques. From that date until today, there are many important things to be told, such as the history of the spread of judo at home and abroad, but to our great regret, the space does not permit us to insert them all. The technical formula of the Kodokan Judo was completed in 1887, while its spiritual phase was gradually built up until it was perfected in approximately 1922, in the year that the Kodokan Cultural Society was established, and a social movement was launched under the slogan Seiryoku Zenyo, the maximum efficiency, and Chitai Kyoe, the mutual welfare and benefit. I also know these as well. That's the first chapter. That's the first chapter of Illustrated Kodokan Judo. There's just so much. There's so much to talk about, to look at. I have mountains and mountains of technique manuals, of treatises and thoughts by ancient masters. Hokey 1950s how to guides, self-defense and super fitness, the authentic guide to judo. Illustrations are fantastic, though. Here's one. Here's the forward. Freedom and continuous charge. The heart should be a clear mirror, polished 1,000 times, and should rely on godlike speed and courage, Kyozo Mifune. I'm sure that's a little bit more eloquent in its native Japanese, in which I'm unable to read it in its calligraphy form. But so much knowledge for me to go over. I can't even hope to, even absorb all of it, even a fraction of it in a single night. With that said, I think this is going to wrap up this particular episode. 45 minutes of ancient Jujitsu, Judo discussion and knowledge is probably enough for a single night. But we'll do this again. We'll certainly do this again. It's been a pleasure to talk about it. I want to talk about it more. Sensei certainly deserves to be talked about more. And so does Judo. I guess I can put out some information. If you'd like to know more information about Judo here in the American Southwest, or specifically in Phoenix, Arizona, you can visit us at Arizona Aikido, just off of 7th Avenue and Camelback, right here in the heart of Phoenix.